The air was thick with tension. A storm was coming. In the small, run-down park, surrounded by cracked sidewalks and rusted benches, Eliana Carter's fingers danced across the worn piano keys, playing a haunting melody that seemed to echo through the empty streets. The tune was her only escape, a way to drown out the noise of the world. Her mother's old piano, sitting crookedly beneath the fading streetlights, was the last piece of home she had left. The notes she played weren't just music, they were memories. But tonight, something was different. There was an unspoken heaviness in the air, a sense of anticipation. It was as if the world around her held its breath. The streetlights flickered. A shadow loomed at the edge of the park. Eliana's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't stop playing. She couldn't. The music was the only thing keeping her together. From the corner of her eye, she saw him. A man, tall, dressed sharply in a black suit, his posture rigid, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. He wasn't from around here. He stood motionless, staring at her with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. He had the look of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. And now, it seemed, he wanted her music. Eliana's fingers faltered for a split second, but then she steeled herself, her hands resuming their steady rhythm. She couldn't afford to be afraid, not now. Not with the storm rising in the distance. The man finally moved. He walked slowly toward her, his steps deliberate, echoing against the quiet night. He stopped a few feet away, standing just out of reach of the dim light. "Beautiful," he said, his voice deep and smooth, but there was something unsettling in his tone. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Eliana didn't answer at first. She didn't trust this stranger, especially not in this part of town. The last thing she needed was to get tangled up in something dangerous. But the words came anyway, as if her music had opened up a part of her she wasn't ready to show. "I taught myself." The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "Self-taught? Impressive. Most people would give anything to have a gift like yours." She didn't know whether to take his words as a compliment or a threat. But she kept her gaze steady. "What do you want?" "Your talent," he said, stepping closer. "I can help you make something of it. You could be great, you know. A star. I can make that happen." Eliana's fingers froze on the keys. She felt a chill wash over her. There was something in his eyes, something dark, that didn't sit right. "And why would you want to help me?" she asked, her voice shaky despite her attempt to stay calm. His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Because I see potential. And I know people who can make sure you don't go unnoticed." There it was, the hook. He wasn't here out of kindness. He was here because he saw value in her talent, something he could take, shape, and turn into a product. She had seen it before, people like him, always looking for something to exploit. Eliana stood up abruptly, the music forgotten. "I don't need your help." The man didn't move. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low, almost warning. "People like you don't get to choose. You don't get to decide when someone like me comes into your life. Trust me, this is your chance." But Eliana was already walking away, the sound of her footsteps louder than the storm clouds gathering in the distance. She didn't need him. She didn't need anyone. Not anymore. But as she turned to leave, she felt his eyes follow her. The feeling that something was very, very wrong didn't go away. It followed her, lingering like a shadow on the edge of her mind. As she disappeared into the night, a small piece of her, something deep inside, whispered a warning. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Eliana couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her heart raced as she walked home through the dark streets, the echoes of James Greenfield's words ringing in her ears. She tried to dismiss it, but the man's presence lingered like a shadow, hanging over her every step. The park was now behind her, the eerie silence of the night wrapping itself around her like a heavy blanket. She couldn't focus on anything other than the unease in her chest. The moment she stepped into the small, dimly lit apartment she called home, she was met with the comforting scent of her aunt's cooking. Her aunt, Renee, was sitting at the small kitchen table, cutting vegetables for dinner. Her movements were quick, precise, like everything in her life had a rhythm. When Eliana entered, Renee looked up with a warm, welcoming smile. "How was your day?" she asked, not looking up from the knife. Eliana hesitated. She wanted to tell her aunt everything about the stranger in the park, about James Greenfield and his offer. But something held her back. Maybe it was the way her aunt's face shifted when she mentioned anything about music. Renee didn't fully understand Eliana's passion for piano. She saw it as just a way to keep the girl occupied, not a path to something bigger. "It was fine," Eliana lied, sitting down at the table. "Nothing special." Renee studied her for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly as if she sensed something wasn't quite right. But she didn't press the matter. She always respected Eliana's need for space. After all, Eliana had always been a private person, especially since her mother's passing. "Dinner's almost ready," Renee said with a soft smile. "Sit down, and I'll tell you a story about your mom." Eliana froze at the mention of her mother. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with words unsaid. Eliana never got tired of hearing stories about Clara. It was the only way she could feel close to the mother she had lost so suddenly. "What's the story?" Eliana asked quietly, trying to push away the nagging feeling that had settled in her stomach. Renee's hand stilled, the knife pausing mid-air as she stared down at the vegetables. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than usual. "Your mother," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "she was a brilliant musician. People don't know this, but before you were born, she was part of a small, exclusive group of musicians. She worked with some big names in the industry, including the Greenfields." Eliana's pulse quickened at the mention of the Greenfields. She hadn't expected to hear that name again so soon. But she didn't let it show. "Greenfield? What do you mean?" Eliana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean, the James Greenfield?" Renee's gaze met hers, and for a moment, Eliana saw something flicker in her eyes, something she had never noticed before. It was a mix of pain, regret, and something else, something dangerous. "Yes," Renee replied softly. "Your mother worked with them. But it wasn't the way people think. It was never just about the music for her. She wanted something more, something real. But the Greenfields, they weren't interested in that. Not at all." Eliana leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What happened, Aunt Renee? Why did she leave the music world? Why did she disappear?" Renee's face darkened, her eyes clouded with memories she clearly didn't want to relive. "I told you this before, Eliana," she said softly. "Your mother was a force. She had talent, a gift. But she was also smart, too smart for them. She realized what was happening. She realized what they were doing to people like her." Eliana's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What were they doing?" Renee took a deep breath. "They were exploiting young talent, Eliana. They took the best, the brightest, and used them for their own gain. Your mother, she discovered something she wasn't supposed to know. They wanted her to stop asking questions, to stop digging. So they made her disappear." Eliana felt the floor shift beneath her, as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. She thought she knew the story, but this was something else entirely. "Aunt Renee, you mean, they killed her?" Eliana whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Renee's silence was answer enough. The next day, Eliana couldn't focus. Her mind kept replaying the conversation with her aunt, the shock of her mother's true fate still fresh and raw. The storm clouds of doubt and anger gathered inside her like an unstoppable force. She couldn't sit back and do nothing. Not when she knew the truth. She had to know more. She had to find out what her mother had uncovered before her untimely death. Eliana had heard rumors about the Greenfields before, but she never imagined it could be as bad as what her aunt had just told her. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. James Greenfield. He had offered her a chance, a way to make her music more than just a hobby. He'd promised her the world. But his intentions weren't about helping her, he wanted to exploit her, just like he had done to her mother. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one. Eliana knew that she needed to confront him. She couldn't let him get away with what he'd done to her mother, or to anyone else. But she needed something more than just words. She needed proof. She began her search in the only place she could think of, her mother's old music notes and journals, hidden in a box under her bed. The box, dusty and worn, had always been there, but Eliana had never dared to look inside. Until now. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing old sheet music, faded photographs, and letters that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. She flipped through the pages quickly, scanning for anything that could shed light on what had happened to her mother. Then, she found it. A small, handwritten note tucked into the back of a photo album. Her mother's handwriting. The note read, "They are dangerous, Eliana. Don't trust them. If anything happens to me, you need to finish what I started. Find the truth. I'll always be with you." Eliana's heart pounded in her chest as she held the note in her hand. This was it. This was the key. She could no longer turn away. James Greenfield had no idea what he was about to face. Eliana knew she had to take the next step. She couldn't just sit back anymore. With the letter from her mother in hand, she made up her mind. She would confront James Greenfield. But this time, she wouldn't be the naive girl he had met before. This time, she was armed with the truth. The next morning, Eliana woke up with a single thought in her mind: I have to confront James Greenfield. Her fingers clenched around the note from her mother, the small, fragile piece of paper that held the truth she'd been searching for. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The weight of what she had discovered pressed down on her chest, but it also fueled her determination. She wasn't going to let her mother's death go unanswered. She wasn't going to let the Greenfields continue exploiting young talent, using people like her mother, and now her, as stepping stones to their empire. Eliana knew she had to be careful. James was powerful. His company was one of the biggest names in the industry, and the connections he had could make life incredibly difficult for anyone who crossed him. But she had no choice. She couldn't let fear control her anymore. She spent the morning preparing, going through the journal entries her mother had left behind, scribbling notes, highlighting the inconsistencies, the unanswered questions. Eliana was never one to back down, but today, she had to be strategic. If she was going to expose James Greenfield and his family for what they'd done, she needed something that would make him listen. By late afternoon, Eliana had gathered her courage. She had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was all she had. She took one last look at the handwritten note from her mother and placed it carefully inside her bag. The truth had to be shared. James Greenfield's office was everything she expected: sleek, polished, and intimidating. The building stood tall, a glass behemoth in the heart of the city, a symbol of everything he represented: power, control, money. When she arrived at the front desk, the receptionist didn't even look up. "Can I help you?" she asked without any real interest. "I'm here to see Mr. Greenfield," Eliana said, her voice steady but her heart racing. The receptionist raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't, but I'm sure he'll want to see me," Eliana replied, her confidence growing with every passing second. She wasn't sure how long she could keep up this act, but she had to try. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, but then picked up the phone. "I'll let him know you're here." Eliana stood in the sleek, modern lobby, the hum of the city outside seeming distant. Time seemed to stretch, and just as her nerves started to get the best of her, a voice came from behind her. "Miss Carter," James Greenfield's voice cut through the silence. "I've been expecting you." Eliana turned to face him. James stood tall in a perfectly tailored suit, his gaze fixed on her. His confident demeanor only added to the tension in the air. He knew who she was. But did he know what she had discovered? "I'm glad you could make it," James said with a tight smile, extending his hand. "What can I do for you?" Eliana ignored his hand. She wasn't here to be polite or to play games. "I know what you did," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the pleasantries. "I know what happened to my mother. And I know what you've been doing to people like her. People like me." James's smile faltered, just for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, his voice smooth, though there was an edge to it now. Eliana stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "You used her. You used all of them. My mother, Clara, she was brilliant. She found you when you were nobody, gave you a shot. And you repay her by pushing her out, making her disappear. And now you're trying to do the same to me. Well, it's not going to work." For a brief moment, James didn't speak. His expression remained unchanged, but the coldness in his eyes made Eliana's blood run cold. Finally, he spoke. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice a low growl. "Your mother's decisions were hers, not mine. She made her choices, Eliana. You don't know everything. There's a lot more to this than you think." Eliana's heart raced as she stepped back. She had expected him to deny it, but hearing it from his own lips made it all feel more real, more sinister. He wasn't going to admit anything. But she wasn't leaving without making him listen. She reached into her bag and pulled out the note her mother had left her. She held it up, her hand steady. "I don't care what you say," Eliana said, her voice unwavering. "This is what my mother left me. A warning. A truth. And I'm going to make sure the world knows it." James's eyes flickered to the note, and for a second, Eliana could see the faintest hint of fear. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you can threaten me with that?" he asked, his voice tight with a barely contained anger. "You think you can just waltz in here and bring down everything I've built? It's not that simple, Eliana. You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," she shot back. "You're not untouchable, James. You're just a man. And I'm going to make sure people know what kind of man you really are." For a moment, they stood there, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, without another word, James turned on his heel and walked toward his office. He paused just before entering, his back to her. "Don't make this worse for yourself," he said, his voice colder than ever. "You don't want to be on the other side of this." Eliana didn't answer. She didn't need to. The damage was already done. She had planted the seed. Now it was time for the truth to grow. As Eliana left the Greenfield building, she felt a mix of adrenaline and dread. Confronting James had been exactly what she needed, but now she realized how deep the game went. He wasn't the only enemy here. This was bigger than she thought. Her mind raced as she walked through the streets, the chaos of the city surrounding her. The storm was finally here. She had started a war. Eliana woke up the next morning with a headache, but it wasn't the kind that came from lack of sleep. It was the weight of the conversation with James Greenfield still hanging over her, gnawing at her thoughts. She had done what she set out to do, she confronted him, pushed him, made him squirm. But the calm in his eyes when he walked away lingered in her mind. He wasn't scared. He wasn't intimidated. If anything, he'd been amused by her. That, more than anything, made her uneasy. It was like he was playing a game she hadn't yet figured out. But she couldn't afford to waste any more time. She had one goal now, get the truth out. Expose the Greenfields for what they had done to her mother, and the countless others they'd trampled along the way. Eliana decided that if James wasn't going to help her, she'd find another way. She started digging through her mother's belongings once again, this time more methodically, determined to find any hint, any clue that could lead her to the missing pieces of the puzzle. She found a small notebook buried deep inside one of her mother's music sheets. It wasn't a diary, but a collection of names, dates, and cryptic notes. Some were about people her mother had worked with. Others were about music contracts and business dealings. The most chilling entry, however, was the one that stood out. Her mother had written the word, Project Crescendo. Eliana frowned. She had never heard of it before. What was Project Crescendo? And why had her mother written it down if it meant nothing? She grabbed her phone and Googled it. Her heart skipped a beat when an article popped up, a music project under the Greenfield Company that had gone underground years ago, rumored to involve secretive contracts with young musicians, including several that had vanished without a trace. The names of the missing were listed, and to her horror, her mother's name appeared right at the top of the list. That was it. This was no coincidence. Project Crescendo was the key to everything. It was the reason her mother had disappeared. And it was the thing James would do anything to protect. But finding the truth wasn't going to be easy. Eliana knew she needed help. She couldn't take on the Greenfields alone, not when they had so much power. She reached out to someone she trusted, a reporter she had known through her mother's past, Marcus Hayes. Marcus Hayes was a seasoned journalist, known for his investigations into corrupt organizations and his relentless pursuit of the truth. Eliana had met him a few years ago when her mother had briefly worked as a consultant on a music-related project. Marcus was one of the few people her mother had trusted. When Eliana called him, he answered on the first ring. "Eliana? What's going on?" Marcus's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. He knew something was coming. "I need your help," Eliana said quickly. "I'm not sure who else to trust right now. Tell me what happened." She explained everything, the confrontation with James, the discovery of Project Crescendo, and the chilling list of missing people her mother had documented. Marcus listened intently, not interrupting. "This is huge," he said after a long pause. "Eliana, this isn't just about your mother. It's bigger than that. These people, they've been using young artists for years. Exploiting them, disappearing them when they're no longer useful. And I think they've covered their tracks well, but I've got some sources who might be able to help." "I'm not waiting around for them to help," Eliana replied, determination in her voice. "I need to get to the bottom of this now." Marcus agreed to meet with her in person. They decided to meet at a small cafe near the city's downtown, a neutral place where they could talk freely without prying eyes. Eliana arrived first, scanning the room nervously. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't just sitting down for coffee, she was sitting down to plot her next move in a game that could cost her everything. When Marcus finally arrived, he looked the same as always, tired, but with the sharp eyes of someone who never missed a detail. After a brief greeting, he sat down across from her. "We need to find evidence," Marcus said, not wasting any time. "If we can get the right documents, things that tie Project Crescendo to Greenfield Enterprises, then we can expose everything. But you need to be careful. This is dangerous. These people don't play by the rules." "I know," Eliana said, her voice steady. "But I have to do this." Marcus nodded. "All right. Here's what we're going to do. I have a contact who worked on the Project Crescendo contract back in the day. He'll know more about the details, especially about the musicians involved. We can start there. It's not going to be easy, but I think we can get something." Eliana felt a surge of hope. This could be it, the break she needed. They spent the next hour discussing their plan in detail, mapping out the steps they needed to take. Marcus was right, this would be dangerous. But it was the only way to expose the truth. The next few days were a blur of research, phone calls, and cautious meetings. Eliana and Marcus followed leads, piecing together a trail that seemed to grow darker with every step. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the revelations became. They found that Project Crescendo wasn't just a failed music project, it was a front for something much worse. The missing musicians were part of a covert program designed to exploit young talent for commercial gain. They were promised fame and success, only to be discarded when they became too much of a liability. Some had disappeared completely. Others had been forced into silence by threats or intimidation. The worst part was realizing that her mother had been one of the early victims of this system. Her mother had uncovered something far more sinister, which led to her forced exit from the music industry. And James Greenfield? He wasn't just an innocent bystander, he was complicit in it all. Marcus and Eliana managed to get their hands on a few key documents, contracts, old emails, and meeting notes, that linked James and his family to Project Crescendo. The connections were undeniable. But they needed more. They needed something concrete, something that would blow the lid off the entire operation. "I know where we can find more," Marcus said one afternoon, after a particularly long and frustrating day of research. "I have a source who worked with Clara on some of those early projects. They might know where we can find the missing records." Eliana's heart skipped a beat. This could be the breakthrough they needed. But it would come with risks. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. They met the next night at a rundown apartment building on the edge of town, a place where secrets were kept and promises were broken. Marcus's contact, an older man named Raymond, had been a part of the inner circle in the early days of Project Crescendo. He was nervous but determined to help. "I don't know how much I can give you," Raymond said, his voice low and cautious. "But I know enough to tell you this: your mother was right. She found out too much. The Greenfields had no choice but to silence her." Eliana felt the weight of his words like a punch to the gut. She had always suspected it, but hearing it from someone who had been there was different. This was real. Raymond handed over a folder, thick with paperwork. "These are the documents that will prove everything. It's not much, but it's enough to get started. You have to be careful, though. If the Greenfields find out you have this, they won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to keep it quiet." Eliana nodded, taking the folder with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Raymond's eyes softened, and for the first time, he looked at Eliana with a kind of pity. "Be careful, kid. The truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes, it costs more than you can pay." Eliana and Marcus reviewed the documents late into the night. The evidence they had was irrefutable. It was time to act. The truth was finally within their reach. They would expose the Greenfields. They would show the world who they really were. And no matter the cost, Eliana wouldn't stop until her mother's legacy was restored. But the storm was far from over. The morning after receiving the crucial documents from Raymond, Eliana felt both empowered and terrified. The weight of the truth she now held in her hands was immense. She had all the evidence she needed to expose the Greenfields and their exploitation of countless young musicians, starting with her mother. But there was no going back. Once the truth was out, everything would change. James Greenfield wouldn't sit idly by while his empire crumbled. Eliana knew that, but she couldn't let fear control her anymore. Her mother had fought for the truth, and now it was her turn to finish what was started. Marcus had been invaluable in the last few days, helping her sift through the piles of paperwork and organizing everything for the big reveal. The plan was simple: they would send the documents to a national news outlet, one that had a reputation for breaking stories about corruption in the entertainment industry. Once the news was out, there would be no turning back. "I'll get in touch with them today," Marcus said, his face set in determination. "But we need to make sure we cover our tracks. The Greenfields won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to shut this down." Eliana nodded, understanding the stakes. "I'll make sure no one knows we've sent anything. We can't risk them tracing it back to us." As they prepared to make the final move, Eliana couldn't shake the feeling that the Greenfields were already one step ahead. James was powerful. He had resources at his disposal. And while Eliana had the truth, it didn't always guarantee success. In fact, it often made people more dangerous. "I'm ready," Eliana said, her voice firm. "Let's do it." Marcus paused for a moment before nodding. "All right. It's time to make sure the truth sees the light of day." The night before the documents were sent to the news outlet, Eliana couldn't sleep. The uncertainty gnawed at her. She had the evidence. She knew the truth. But what if it wasn't enough? What if the Greenfields managed to cover it all up again? But then she thought of her mother, her sacrifice, her fight. She couldn't let fear stop her from doing what was right. When morning finally arrived, Eliana and Marcus were ready. Marcus had arranged for the documents to be delivered anonymously, ensuring there was no trace back to them. The news outlet, a major investigative journalism site, had promised to run the story as soon as they received the files. It wasn't long after the documents were sent that the first wave of panic set in. Eliana received a call from Marcus. His voice was tight with urgency. "They're on to us," he said. "I've been contacted by someone from Greenfield Enterprises. They know we're behind this. They're already moving fast to stop it." Eliana's heart dropped. She had expected resistance, but this was faster than she thought. The Greenfields weren't going to let the story go public without a fight. "They're already making threats," Marcus continued. "They're trying to intimidate the news outlet. They want to shut it down before it even gets out." Eliana's mind raced. She couldn't let them succeed. "We have to act fast," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "The world needs to know what they've done." Within hours, the Greenfields legal team was firing back. A barrage of lawsuits and cease and desist orders flooded the news outlet's inbox. The legal pressure was immense. But the journalists were undeterred, determined to publish the story no matter the cost. The battle was on. The truth was now a weapon in the hands of Eliana and Marcus. They just had to make sure it reached the right people, and that no one silenced them before it was too late. The days that followed were a blur of legal battles, threats, and mounting tension. Eliana and Marcus spent every waking hour working behind the scenes, keeping track of every development. The Greenfields were throwing everything they had at them. They hired private investigators, launched media smear campaigns, and even tried to bribe some of the reporters working on the story. But Eliana wasn't backing down. Her determination only grew stronger with every new obstacle the Greenfields put in her path. She knew they wouldn't stop until they had silenced her, but she also knew they were running out of time. Then, one morning, it happened. The story went live. The headline read, "The Hidden Empire, How Greenfield Enterprises Exploited Young Talent and Covered Up the Truth." The article detailed everything Eliana had uncovered: the secretive contracts, the missing musicians, the manipulative tactics used by James Greenfield and his family. It wasn't just a story about her mother anymore, it was a full-scale exposé on the entire corrupt system that had been operating for years. Eliana stood in her small apartment, reading the article on her laptop. The room felt like it was spinning. She had done it. The truth was out. Her mother's legacy, her fight, was finally being acknowledged. But as Eliana's eyes scanned the article, a chill ran down her spine. She saw that the Greenfields weren't done. The legal threats were escalating, and their PR team was already working overtime to discredit the article and destroy its credibility. The Greenfields had money. They had power. And they weren't going to let this go quietly. As the days passed, the situation grew more volatile. The Greenfields weren't just threatening the news outlet anymore, they were targeting Eliana directly. Her phone rang constantly, filled with harassing calls. The intimidation tactics were escalating. She knew they were coming for her next. Then, one evening, Eliana received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was smooth, calm, and eerily familiar. "It's James," he said, his tone like ice. "We need to talk." Eliana felt a surge of anger, but she kept her voice steady. "There's nothing to talk about." "Oh, there's plenty," James replied. "You've made a mess of things. But I'm willing to make a deal." Elena's pulse quickened. She knew what this was, an attempt to control the narrative, to silence her in exchange for something. But she had no intention of backing down now. "I'm listening," she said, her voice low. James paused for a moment. "You're out of your depth here, Elena. I can make all of this go away. I can give you everything you've ever wanted. Fame. Power. Recognition. All of it can be yours, if you agree to stop this little campaign of yours." Elena's grip on the phone tightened. "You think you can buy me?" she spat. "You think you can buy the truth?" James laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're clever, I'll give you that. But you're also naive. You can't win this fight. Not without consequences. But if you stop, if you leave all of this behind, I'll make sure you have a future. A real future. You won't be left to fade into nothing." The offer hung in the air like a poisoned apple. Elena didn't hesitate. "I'd rather die fighting than live with the truth buried." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then James spoke again, his voice colder than ever. "Very well," he said. "But don't say I didn't offer you a way out." The line went dead. The days after the confrontation with James Greenfield were a blur. The legal battles continued, but Elena could feel the tide turning. The public was behind her. The truth was out, and people were starting to see the Greenfields for what they truly were. Elena had won. She had exposed the corruption, the exploitation, and the lies. But the cost had been high. She had lost her sense of safety, her privacy, and her old life. But in exchange, she had gained something more valuable, her mother's legacy. And a future where no one could ever silence her again. The days following the exposure of the Greenfields' empire were filled with uncertainty. Elena could feel the weight of everything that had transpired. The world had seen the truth, but the battle wasn't over yet. The Greenfields still had power, and the legal aftermath of their actions was far from finished. Elena's life had changed in ways she couldn't fully grasp. The fear she had once felt had been replaced with something else, empowerment. It was a strange feeling, knowing that her mother's fight was finally being acknowledged. But even as the news spread, Elena knew there was a price to pay. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be uncovered, more that needed to be done. The Greenfields may have lost their grip on the public eye, but they were still powerful. Their empire might be crumbling, but the influence they had over the music industry was far from over. Elena found herself at a crossroads. She had achieved the impossible, exposing the truth, giving her mother's legacy the recognition it deserved. But there was still so much left to do. So many others still trapped in the same system of exploitation that had nearly swallowed her whole. But this time, she wasn't alone. Marcus had become more than just a journalist to her. He was an ally, a friend, and someone who had stood by her side when things seemed impossible. He, too, had watched the Greenfields fall from grace, but now, he was focused on making sure that their downfall wasn't just a momentary flash in the pan. Together, they began to work on something bigger, the Justice Foundation for Young Artists. It would be an organization dedicated to helping young talent, offering them the resources and protection they needed to navigate the dangerous world of the music industry. The goal wasn't just to take down the bad guys, it was to build something better. Something lasting. As the days passed, Elena continued to push forward, using her mother's music as a beacon of hope for others who had been taken advantage of. She was no longer the scared girl playing piano in an empty park. She was a force in her own right. The world knew her name, and she had earned it. One crisp evening, as Elena sat in a small cafe, reflecting on everything that had happened, Marcus joined her. His eyes were tired, but there was a glimmer of something new in them, hope. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just chasing a story. He was helping to create something real. Something meaningful. "They'll never be able to silence you," Marcus said, setting down a coffee in front of her. "They'll never be able to take away your fight." Eliana smiled softly. "I think I've learned that the hard way." He chuckled. "You've done more than anyone could have imagined. And there's still so much to do. We're just getting started." Eliana looked out the window, watching as the world continued to turn, oblivious to the quiet revolution she had started. She had exposed the green fields. She had faced the darkest parts of the music industry. And she had emerged stronger for it. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something greater. A chance to build a world where talent was respected and protected. A world where people could achieve their dreams without being preyed upon by those who sought only to exploit them. With a renewed sense of purpose, Eliana stood up from the table. "Let's get to work," she said, her voice steady, filled with determination. As she walked out into the evening, the sky overhead was painted in hues of pink and orange. The storm had passed, and in its place was a new dawn. The battle was over. But the war for justice had just begun. Eliana's journey wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about giving others a voice. It was about creating a future where young artists could thrive without fear of exploitation. The Greenfields' empire had crumbled, but the legacy of their downfall was only the beginning of the change Eliana had set in motion. Her foundation, backed by countless artists and supporters, became a beacon for change in the music industry. Musicians from all walks of life, once silenced by fear, now stood proudly in the light, knowing that they had the support and protection they deserved. The Greenfields' corruption would never again take root, and Eliana knew that the music world would be forever different because of what she had fought for. And as for Eliana, she continued to play her piano, but now, every note she played was a reminder of the battle she had won and the future she was building. The world was hers to shape, and she wasn't going to stop until every artist, every person, had the chance to chase their dreams without fear. The world would remember her name. Not for the pain she'd endured, but for the change she'd created.